Bryan Buckley was a standout on the football field in high school. Team captain, school leader, and eventually a U.S. Marine serving in Iraq. Colby Umbrell played against Bryan at a rival high school where he too was an exceptional player, well-liked and embraced by fellow students and athletes. Like Bryan, he chose to serve his country, and like his one-time rival, ended up in a war zone. Only one of them returned, but the lessons they learned as football players and as soldiers are being shared with us this hour in a very special It's Your Call. And it all begins right now. Hello everyone, I'm Lynn Doyle. Thank you for joining me for a very special show. It's the story of two boys who shared the love of football, who grew up to be two men who shared a love of their country. One went to Central Bucks West High School, a perennial football champion, where he paid his dues under a tough coach and eventually became the team captain. Bryan Buckley enjoyed tremendous success while a member of that team, winning state championships and learning some valuable lessons about leadership and team building. His one-time middle school friend, Colby Umbrell, chose to follow a different path. He chose Central Bucks East, a longtime rival of West, whose teams may not have had the winning records like West, but commanded its respect nonetheless. Colby faced some tough lessons as well on the football field, including a devastating injury. When high school ended, they were athletes who had to realize that their dreams of landing in the NFL may not come true. And through college, they searched for something that would give them discipline, satisfaction, and the rewards that football had brought them. In a post-9/11 world, that something was serving their country, which they did with the same commitment they brought to the gridiron. Sadly, that commitment cost one of them their lives. The story of Bryan and Colby is told in a new book called Fading Echoes, a true story of rivalry and brotherhood from the football field to the fields of honor. It's by Mike Sealski, a sports columnist for Calkins Media and a friend of this show. Mike, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Lynn. I appreciate it.
Tell me what motivated you and inspired you to write this story of Bryan and Colby.
I had known both Colby and Bryan when I first got into sports writing. I covered them their senior years at CB West and CB East. And I always remembered that year. It was my first full-time job in sports writing. I had so much fun covering the rivalry and covering those teams. And years go by, and as I explain in the book, Colby becomes an Army Ranger, and he was killed in Iraq in May of 2007. And I read a newspaper story about it and thought, you know, it just struck me because here was somebody who I had known years before in a kind of tangential kind of way, and just wanted to know more about why he decided to take this path. And so I reached out to his parents, Mark and Nancy, did a series of newspaper articles about Colby, and thought there's a broader story here. But because the story of Doylestown high school football, if you're going to write a story about Doylestown high school football, it has to include CB West in some form, because CB West in the late 1990s was probably the greatest program in the state of Pennsylvania. So I had to find some kind of connection to CB West. I found that learning about Bryan Buckley and what he had been doing with his life, becoming a Marine, serving in Fallujah, and from there it just kind of took shape.
You said that there's a broader story than just high school football.
Yes.
How would you define what that broad story is?
I think it's a story about. It's funny that there's an old joke about Ernest Hemingway. He's challenged to write a story in 6 words, and he's able to do it. And if I had to boil this story down to 6 words, it would be 2 athletes from Doylestown become warriors. And I was intrigued by that transition, by the way that Colby and Bryan grew as individuals, and what was the connection between the way they played football and why they played football and why they decided to become an Army Ranger and a Marine.
So this could really be any town USA.
Absolutely.
You don't have to be from Bucks County, Pennsylvania to appreciate this story or to learn from it.
No, I mean, I think the story is, if it's possible, I think the story is both unique and universal. You know, there are a million small towns out there with a million high school football rivalries and a million kids who grow up wanting to make football part of their lives and who end up finding something else. For these two guys, serving their country, putting themselves in the heart of harm's way was what they wanted to do, what they ultimately decided they needed to do. And to me, that was just a dramatic, compelling story.
But that part of the story didn't happen for a while. When you first met them and knew them and reported on them, they were boys, essentially, playing high school football. But it wasn't just any high school football. As you said, it was one was for a perennial powerhouse, another was for a very well-respected program. Tell us about these two individuals. They knew each other in middle school, went to competing high schools. What was Bryan Buckley like as a boy, as a high school student? That's
interesting. Bryan was, as he is today, very outgoing. Was the guy, as a sports writer covering high school football, it's not often that you find high school students or high school athletes who are able to be very eloquent and open with you in talking about their respective sports. Bryan was that way, even as a high school senior. He was kind of the go-to quote if such a thing existed. Showed leadership qualities even back then, was very popular amongst the student body at CB West, was really kind of the emotional leader of that football team. He was not the guy who carried the ball all the time, didn't score all the touchdowns, but when the locker room needed to be straightened out, it was Bryan Buckley who straightened those guys out.
Conversely, how would Colby compare as a football player and as a high school student?
Very comparable. Colby was a terrific offensive and defensive lineman for CB East. He was also a team captain. Probably a little quieter than Bryan, just naturally could be very serious, but also had a real silly side, could make time for humor, and but very, very committed to doing well. I mean, the reason he went to CB East was because his father had played football there, and it was very important for him to play where his dad had played.
Any indication to you as a reporter covering those two, the paths that their lives would take and that they would cross again in the future?
Not really, only because I don't think I knew them all well enough to make that kind of judgment or to predict that kind of thing for them. I just knew them as two kids who were terrific football players who, from my interactions with them, seemed to be terrific 18-year-old kids, and whatever the future lay ahead for them, I thought it would be good.
We had no idea at the time that, of course, we would be living in a post-9/11 world. We're going to talk about the impact that September 11th did have on both of these young men. But first, as always, if you have comments about our topic, we do invite you to reach out and talk to us. And if you have questions or perhaps remembrances about Bryan or Colby that you'd like to share, here's how you can do it. You can log on to csnphilly.com, and then you put in "It's Your Call" or IYC under the search title. That will take you to my webpage where you can leave me a comment. If you have something that you'd like to share or perhaps get a message to either of those young men's parents, you can do that by emailing me directly here at the show as well. That's tcn_IYC@cable.comcast.com. Now, like most kids, especially boys who play football, there are dreams of playing in the NFL, if not at least college. And for both of these young men, there was a little struggle upon graduation. It didn't quite, the path to the NFL didn't quite open up and welcome either one of them.
I don't know that it does for anybody, but no, Colby had suffered a pretty serious knee injury during his senior season. He tore his anterior cruciate ligament, which is a very serious injury.
Yes, I know, I've had it.
And remarkably, he came back and played that season. He put off and delayed surgery so that he could come back and finish his senior season, which, if you think about it, is really a remarkable thing. And as he moves on, I think he knew at an earlier age that the military was something he wanted to be a part of, and ultimately that was his long-term goal. He would play football as long as he enjoyed it, as long as he could play it as hard and as well as he always had, but ultimately the military was going to be where his energy went. I think Bryan, the transition was a little more abrupt. It happens when he's in college, when he's initially at the University of Massachusetts. He realized 9/11 happens, and he realizes that, you know what, I've devoted so much of my life to football and to my football career that with what happened on 9/11, it's time for me to start doing some things for some other people.
And I mentioned that September 11th had such a huge impact on the two individuals who are the focus of this new book by Mike called Fading Echoes. It's really a very intriguing story. I suggest that you do get it, regardless of where you live, because these are two individuals that you will just connect with and you will relate to. And of course, it does have a lot of lessons included in it, but it also has tragedy as well. Joining us now, the parents of the fallen soldier, Nancy and Mark Umbrell.